All right, good morning, everybody. So we are now starting our eighth unit. This one is going to be primarily about the Cold War and decolonization. So we are going to start with 8.1, which is setting the stage for the Cold War and decolonization. So a lot of this is context building, just setting up the stage of things that have to come in later in this unit that we'll get into much more detail about. Okay. So today's essential questions are: what events, persons, and circumstances led to the start of the Cold War? And then number two, what events and circumstances led to the anti-colonial movements during and after World War II? So those are questions that you'll need to answer on Canvas and respond to. So make sure you keep them in mind as we go through this information itself. So let's start with the basic. This is the key concept that is put on by College Board. So hopes for greater self-government were largely unfulfilled following World War I. However, in the years following World War II, increasingly anti-imperialist sentiments contributed to the dissolution of empires and restructuring of states. All right, so we're going to put me somewhere here. All right. So first of all, some basic context. The alliances in World War II were not the strongest of alliances. They were alliances of convenience. The democratic capitalist countries of the United States, of the UK, formed a bond with the Soviets, who we know were more of a totalitarian and communist regime under Stalin during that time. And so the basic idea is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, the Soviets, were a strong nation, strong enough to take seriously as an ally, but neither side really saw eye to eye on each decision that they made moving forward. So there's a lot of things that a lot of contentions between the alliances, but they kind of put those mostly aside for the time being during World War II, while they were trying to focus on defeating fascism against Germany and Japan. So the leaders of the Allied nations during World War II, the United States, which of course was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, UK was Winston Churchill, and USSR was Joseph Stalin. So they're going to hold meetings during the course of the war to kind of strategize how are they going to defeat Hitler in Germany, and then of course later Japan. But they're mainly going to focus on those things, and then there are also going to be discussions of what is the post-war world going to look like after Germany is defeated, in hopes that they do defeat them. In some of these meetings, that it was pretty apparent that they were going to. So the first meeting was the Tehran Conference, which is in Iran, capital of Iran. And so the big three, as they kind of become known, end up meeting. Lots of things discussed. The main thing that we need to focus on is what they're going to talk about as far as what each side is going to be responsible for during the World War II. And so the United States and the United Kingdom focused on trying to, they basically were saying they were going to be responsible for Western Europe and liberating Western Europe and those countries. And then the USSR would come from the East and kind of pinch, the Germans and fight them from both sides. And then they would be responsible for helping liberate Eastern Europe from Nazi control. So that's kind of, there's of course much more to the Tehran Conference than that, but in purposes of, this lecture, that's essentially what you need to know about the Tehran Conference as an event that helps lead towards the Cold War. Fast forward to the Yalta Conference, and Yalta is in, it's in modern day Russia because it was annexed from Ukraine, but it's on a peninsula, in the Black Sea. And at Yalta, they had another conference in which they basically disagreed with each other. The UK and the US disagreed with Stalin and the Soviets about what the restructure of Europe is going to be. One thing that Stalin really insisted on, because the Soviets had suffered so much during World War II in terms of people and their economy and industry, basically obliterated on the western sides of their country. They wanted reparations, and that was something that wasn't really well liked by the other allies because, again, they go back to World War One, reparations, and it destroys Germany, leads to the rise of extremists such as Hitler. And so there was a feeling that maybe reparations wasn't the best way to go, but that was something that Stalin really wanted. And so, they disagreed with how they're going to restructure Europe and everything. And more important points is the U.S. and the U.K. wanted all of these liberated countries to be eventually, they would come in, they would help them kind of create stability, and then allow the people of those countries to have free democratic elections to choose governments of their liking. And of course, the U.S. and U.K. are kind of thinking, well, if the people had the right to choose, then they would choose like free market capitalism and all of that. And the Soviets believed that, well, the only right way to rebuild a country is in the Soviet model of communism and somewhat authoritarianism as well. And so, they wanted that. The USSR wanted to have a large amount of influence on the Eastern European countries, especially the countries that buffered between Germany and the Soviets. And Russia has this history of being invaded. You go back to the Napoleonic Wars, where they're invaded by Napoleon, and if it wasn't for a very harsh winter, which seems to happen a lot in Russia in history, they were under siege by Napoleon. In World War One, they were attacked by the Germans and Austro-Hungarian Empire. In World War II, of course, they are invaded by the Nazis in Germany, and that's just simply how it went for their history. And so they wanted some sort of buffer zone states between them, something that would help slow them down and allow them to mobilize in case Germany ever came to power again and wanted to invade them. And so they wanted to have a large amount of influence on those new governments in the Eastern Europe. More importantly, they wanted friendly communist governments in place there. And so this kind of difference of opinion between the two is something that will carry forward because they never settled the issue itself. They did kind of agree to allow some influence to in exchange for the USSR to declare war on Japan as soon as Germany had been defeated, in hopes that the Japanese would surrender quicker if they had another giant coming down on them as well. Okay, so then fast forward to the Potsdam Conference. Now this one takes place after Germany's defeat, VE Day, May 8th, 1945. The Potsdam conference is going to be after that. Potsdam is in Germany. It's about 20 minutes outside of Berlin. Been there. It's very beautiful. It's kind of like the Versailles of the Prussian kings, the Prussian emperors. But at Potsdam, the big three has changed. FDR dies in office in 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, comes to power, becomes the president of the United States. And Truman does not have the same relationship with Stalin. Both of the men kind of are very skeptical of each other. And that definitely, the change of personalities, it probably plays a major role in the downside of the turning down of the relationships between the two. So at Potsdam, Truman takes a hard line about that they need to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. What the Soviets are doing in his mind, and really, it's not hard to argue that the Soviets were basically not liberating these countries, but occupying these countries. The Soviets dug in. They handpicked people to lead the governments. Essentially creating puppet governments. Sometimes we call them satellite nations to the Soviets, to make sure that they, again, had that buffer zone. So once this all kind of settles and such, this kind of sets the stage for what would become the Cold War. These three conferences play major roles and such, and you can see by the time the Potsdam Conference happened, the alliances are no longer allies; they become adversaries more so. And this standoff is going to bleed for pretty much the next 40 years, almost 50 years of world history. So Bunch of other things that are going on, and there's a major shift in power. Parts of Europe and Asia were completely devastated by the war. Japan, of course, we know with the firebombing and the atomic bombs, are devastated by the war. Russia, the western sides of Russia are completely devastated by the World War. But smartly enough, they did move a lot of their manufacturing to the eastern parts of their country, away from the bombings and the ability for the Nazis to take out their manufacturing. The United States, geographically beneficial to the war. There was no technology at that time, but the Nazis could fly bombers and bomb our manufacturing centers in the United States, so they're virtually untouched and been basically turbocharged during World War II to put out huge amounts of manufacturing products. And so the lessons learned of World War II will carry afterwards, and so the manufacturing continues to be turbocharged after World War II as well. So Europe is completely devastated, though. Germany, of course, with the constant bombings by the Allies, the fact that they had fought in Germany and been occupied by Soviet and Allied troops, U.S., U.K., Canadian, French, to name the big ones. And there's other things and such. And so once this kind of happens, the USSR kind of come out on top of after World War II, and they become the new hegemons, the new superpowers, sometimes they're referred to as, in the world. And so they would be competing for spheres of influence around the world, using both hard and soft power. And that's something that I want to explain because you may not have heard that. Soft power is using your economic strength to influence countries. The ability to share technology and things like that, the ability to trade, to influence countries. That's something that the United States definitely has a lot during this time, and even more so today. Hard power is usually referring to military strength, strength of your army and military, of course, the ability to have atomic weapons and such. Both sides are going to use both their hard power and soft power to try to influence countries around the world, because it kind of all goes back to that idea about balance of power. Going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, this is something that has been the way that states have functioned in geopolitics for forever. So, going back to Ascendant Stage 8.1, this is coming from the curriculum itself. Technology and economic gains experienced during World War II by the victorious nations shifted the global balance of power. It's kind of mentioning that right in there. So kind of focus on new military technology. During World War II, there was a lot of new military technology that kind of changes the way the military is still today. Let's put it right there. So new technology developed during World War II helped shift the global powers. We talk about jets, which are developed by the Germans. Of course, the United States, Soviets, and all the other countries began to use jets as the main power of their airplanes now. Rockets, which were developed by the Germans, are going to end up being used a lot by the Soviets and the United States. They even took many of the rocket scientists of the Nazis and brought them to their individual countries. An example of that is Werner von Braun, who was a German who ended up coming to the United States and helping the United States start its own rocket programs, and was a big part involvement in the establishment of NASA. So that's kind of something worth noting. And then, of course, the atomic bombs. And then the United States was the first to detonate the atomic bomb successfully in Los Alamos, New Mexico. They dropped 2 on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb itself was a game changer in warfare. And the fact that the United States had the atomic bomb definitely gave them a lot of influence in the world. They used the threat of it against the Soviets several times before the Soviets developed their own. One example is in Iran, when Iran was occupied by both Soviets and US troops. The Soviets seemed like they were trying to establish a puppet government in Iran. That was a no-go for Truman. For Truman, that's essentially a strategic land that they do not want to have under Soviet control, any part of it, of course, because of oil. And so they threatened Stalin, basically, you better leave or else. And the Soviets don't have the power to counter that, so they decided to leave at the time. But in 1949, the Soviets, they are able to successfully detonate their own bomb. There's a lot of fun stories about how they're able to get that, including some American scientists who were involved in the development of our own atomic bomb may have given them the secret of how to do that, hoping that the balance of power would stop the use of that. So if they have them, we have them, then there's less likelihood that we'll use them again. It's really kind of a fascinating kind of read into it that you guys should check out more information about. But anyway, because of and the hydrogen bombs, which are even more explosive than the atomic bombs themselves, kind of give you an idea of that little chart here, right here. And this is the bombs that were dropped at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And they're big. I mean, this kind of, the chart makes it look like they're insignificant. They're not. I mean, this is Mount Everest right here. The mushroom clouds go higher than Mount Everest. But these atomic bombs, very devastating. The only ones that have ever been used on civilian populations, on cities. Thank God for that. So hopefully that continues. But even bigger bombs were developed, the hydrogen bombs. This is one that was developed by the French that was dropped in 1970. This is Castle Bravo. This is the largest that was ever developed by the United States. We dropped that on a Bikini Atoll. These are huge, huge weapons. I mean, this is going to wipe out New York City and then some, all the surrounding areas as well. The largest bomb that was ever developed was 50 megatons, which was known as the Tsar bomb. And the Russians dropped that in 1961 in an open air test somewhere in northern Siberia. And yeah, devastating effect. And everyone's probably wondering, why would they even need to develop something like this? Well, the United States focused mostly on delivery systems, the ability to deliver a nuclear bomb at pinpoint accuracy, and really they could. The Soviets never could really get that delivery systems as sophisticated as us. So their idea was basically drop one in the general area and just destroy everything, right? So this arms race ensured the Cold War because both sides had these huge devastating weapons. They didn't want to risk the fact that if they drop one on us, then we would drop ours on them and everyone would be destroyed. So what's the point? And so this idea of deterrence, sometimes we call it mutual assured destruction, or MAD, really kind of keeps the Cold War cold and from breaking out into a hot war itself, because if both sides were willing to use them, then that would lead to the destruction of mankind. And that didn't really help win a war, right? So the arms race would play a big role into this, and they both would have huge economic consequences on both countries. An example of that is the United States develops what's called the military-industrial complex, where the United States government will fund the development of weapons into private companies, General Electric, General Motors, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. All of these companies end up getting huge military contracts to develop weapon systems, planes, tanks, you name it. And that ends up creating a huge economic dependency on weapons development in the United States. When we get closer to the end of the Cold War and later topics, our ability to produce more weapons and produce higher sophisticated weapons, and the Soviets trying to keep up with that, ultimately do play a role in why the United States ends up winning, quote unquote, the Cold War itself. So the last thing is that colonialism is undermined during this time of World War II. World War I was very highly involved in the in countries. They would kind of lost my train of thought there. So World War I, a lot of them were these countries that fought on the side of the Allies, who were part of these territorial holdings that the United States, or not, well, U.S., but mostly the UK, the British, the French and so forth, they were promised their freedom and some more self rule after World War One, and it just turned out not to be the case. And we'll talk about this more, like specifically in a later topic. But as these colonial powers were focused on defeating, fascism, Germany, everything, you saw some anti-colonial movements start to happen in some of these countries. And because World War II was all the resources were being used to try to defeat fascism, they kind of start to lose control of their territories. And once World War II is over, many of them, lots and lots of these colonial holdings will end up getting their freedom in different ways through violence, through negotiations, things like that. So the anti-colonial movement and stuff, it also ties into the Cold War, because once these countries become free and independent, both superpowers kind of try to rush in to fill some sort of the void there to get them to be on their side of this conflict. But many of them will choose to be what we call non-aligned. And that's something we'll talk about in later topics. So, okay, so let's go back to the beginning here. These essential questions. Make sure that you answer them on Canvas. If you guys have questions for me, feel free to reach out. But make sure you get these covered and everything. I'm also going to leave this PowerPoint on Canvas as well. And then I'll also add a few more videos in maybe this topic, more likely in other topics as well. But this is kind of setting the stage for Cold War and decolonization. So go ahead and take some time to answer these questions. All right. That's it from me. I hope everyone's safe and healthy, and I miss you all, and I will see you later.